Hello, everyone. Welcome to the SRV podcast. Today, I have on Jan Virostko, and I'll be talking to him about some of his articles that he recently published on our site. He is a regular columnist. He joined our organization, I believe, roughly 2 months ago, something around there, and we're going to have a great discussion. So, Jan, would you be able to just kind of say a couple words, introduce yourself, and then we'll get into the meat of it?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Jan. I am an American. However, both of my parents were born in Slovakia. On my mother's side, she is mostly Rusyn, and my mother's parents grew up in the Rusyn village of Matisova, which is in the Prešov region, just outside of the city of Stara Lubovna. Um, and yeah, I have lived in America all my life, but I've traveled back to Slovakia several times. And I've actually only recently kind of shed light on my own recent heritage within, I'd say, the past 6 months to past 12 months, roughly. And I'd say that's due to the fact that my family was very much so Slovakicized, especially my grandparents during the communist times in Czechoslovakia. But I think as I discovered, the truth about my recent heritage, I kind of realized that I wanted to kind of get more involved with the community, knowing that the community is sort of at risk long term of uh, not dying, but kind of, you know, getting smaller and becoming less relevant. So I kind of want to do as much as I can myself to help the community achieve um, sort of the intellectual sovereignty that we've been needing the past several generations. So yeah, that's basically it.
And you've really, I think, been a breath of fresh air in terms of introducing dialogue that would usually only come from me, or you would look and see something that someone wrote like kind of 40 years ago when they didn't feel so pressured to not talk about these things. And so I think we should just jump into your first major article, and that is lessons from the Lemko-Rusyn Republic. I want to hear first, what were your purposes of covering the Lemko-Rusyn Republic? And then I'll get into some of my thoughts, and I want to hear what you have to respond to that.
So I mean, I can say that since I've been a child, not even a child, like I'd say like a teenager, young teenager, I've always been interested in like politics and geopolitics and kind of nation building in a sense of like the history of nations' borders and the sovereignty of nations. And when I had discovered that there existed a Republic de facto in the past, it kind of caught my interest a lot. And in doing research, I kind of realized that while the Lemko-Rusyn Republic did have its successes in terms of kind of organizing the Lemkos and kind of um, being a decent force of political power, there were also various failures because ultimately the Republic was never actually recognized by any nation, on top of the fact that it only existed for a year and a half to 2 years between um, in the period directly following the First World War, which in and of itself, that time period following the First World War was very hectic politically for Central Europe, just because of the dissolution, dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia. So yeah, I think that the biggest thing that interested me was the fact that there did exist a good amount of political organization in recent history in the past 100 years. And I think that, the biggest thing that we can take from that is the fact that um, Rusyns shouldn't be afraid to organize themselves politically as we have been, I feel like, the past few generations, especially in Europe. Considering the fact that within Europe, there really aren't any Rusyn political organizations that seek to kind of represent the Rusyns in, the various parliaments and congresses around those different countries. And I mean, looking into it deeper, I think that um, like you look at Slovakia. I forgot the name of the political party, but there's a Hungarian rights political party that has a decent amount of power there, and there's various other such parties in the region that exist. And I think that this lack of Rusyn political power is to our detriment, and probably will be into the future if Rusyns don't decide to organize as we did 100 years ago in that sense.
Well, I think it also is a point in time in which we can look at a great many failures just outside of the republic itself. And I like to think of it as both inspiring and a missed opportunity, in the sense that we have to remember this declaration was even after Tallerhoff and
Right.
the murder of a large chunk of the Lemko intelligentsia. And so the fact that they could even do that was inspiring in one sense. I think, again, it shows a common theme throughout Rusyn history, though, in that, number one, Gregory Zhatkovich, the Rusyn American governor of Subcarpathian Rus, he essentially had no interest in answering the Lemko's pleas of having them become part of Subcarpathian Rus, or at least that administrative division in Czechoslovakia. And I think, again, I remember reading one story about from Semyon Pizh in his book, A Short History of Carpathian Russia, which it's kind of funny that people like to translate it as Carpathian Rus, but he didn't think like that back then. So anyways, that's a whole different subject. But he talks a story about how even though we had done all this back in the day, we couldn't stop organizing a council in every district, in every region, to do the most basic decisions. And essentially, everyone wanted to be the president. And so the power was so dispersed, there's nobody really to take charge. And I think that segues into our current situation very well, of that there's no real leaders to lead us in any political sense. And I agree with you that politically we should be forward looking. We actually should have political parties, at least on the regional scale. And we actually do, by the way. The only place in Europe where Rusyns are represented in parliament is Romania, actually.
Really? I didn't know that. Wow.
Yes, they actually have a Rusyn political party there. They have their own seat in parliament. It's the Hutsol Rusyns who are right by the border of Subcarpathia. Yes, they actually do have one. So we have one person in a European parliament and nobody else, which I think is funny, because that's the smallest Rusyn region possible. You know, it's only, I think, 15 villages or something like that. Really small. But anyways.
Yeah, I thought you were gonna say actually Serbia, but I'm even more surprised with Romania, because it's definitely the smallest population out of any of the countries. Wow.
Certainly, yes. And I want to get your take on, of course, people can read this article and evaluate it for themselves, but I want to get your take on why you think this political transformation hasn't happened yet, or from the fact, because I have my own ideas, of course, I can go on about this, but I'm interested in, because obviously if you wrote about something like this, you obviously think that we're not doing something right. We need to evaluate historically why not. So I'm kind of interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I think the biggest, downfall, not downfall even per se, blunder on history was definitely the Soviet kind of suppression of Rusyn identity throughout the rule of Eastern Europe. And if the fact that they were able to at least attempt to, on paper, Ukrainianize or Slovakize or Policize the Rusyn populations of Central and Eastern Europe, and this had a lasting effect on many generations. But I will say that even though their attempts were successful in some ways, in other ways they weren't. So, for example, my grandparents, who grew up in the village of Matislava, they actually they remember going to Ukrainian school in the 1950s for a couple of years when they were young primary school age children. And they told me that, they'd come home and they would speak Ukrainian to their parents and grandparents, and uh, the reactions weren't really too positive. They were basically told not to speak that, um, in the family, because they knew that, the generations above that knew themselves that Ukrainian wasn't their mother tongue. It was po-našemu, even if they didn't call it Rusyn, Rusnatsky, Rusny, like even if they didn't call it that, they knew it wasn't Ukrainian. So, that was definitely, that's why I'd say culturally, the Rusyns have survived. And that's why these days, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, you have plenty of vatras and festivals all over Slovakia, Zakarpattia, the Lemko-Rusyn Voivodina. You have plenty of festivals celebrating Rusyn heritage and culture. But I think that where the Soviets were successful in their Ukrainization, Slovakization policies, etc., was in terms of political power and representation. So I think that especially, after the fall of communism and the fall of the Soviet Union, where you had the vote in Transcarpathia to for independence, where I believe there's 78% that voted for sovereignty,
Yeah.
or not independence.
They voted for regional autonomy. So
regional autonomy, like Crimea.
It wasn't it wasn't the same as Crimea, but it would have been another Crimea, essentially.
Another-ish, okay, Crimea-esque kind of territory. And it was shot down. And I think that ever since then, the Rusyn community in Europe has been, I would argue, scared to kind of attack that beast, especially in Ukraine and Transcarpathia, where I think most of the Rusyn population does live. And I think it varies by region for the specifics, but I think for the most part, it comes down to, so in Slovakia, I think there specifically, I feel like Rusynness itself, like the Rusyn people there, I feel like they almost don't feel the need to kind of garner political power.
Yes, I got that feeling too. I was rather unimpressed by that, if I'm being honest, in that when I go to Transcarpathia and when I've just seen it in my own experience, I shouldn't say Transcarpathia, I should say Subcarpathia, but Subcarpathia, you will see just this just this growth of activism and creativeness all the time from there. It will just be random people will show up. And this might have to do with the population, because if we think about it, there's probably around 700,000 Rusyns there. So, I mean, that's pretty substantial.
It's significant,
right?
Yeah,
and where in Slovakia, you probably have 150,000, 100,000.
Right.
So regardless, I find that it's almost as though life is really easy not doing anything for Rusyns in Slovakia, in the sense that they're not being suppressed, yet it's this type of being okay to succumb to this kind of mediocre cultural life, right?
Well,
and
I'm sorry. I'd also like to add to that, which this will probably kind of funnel into the next article a little bit too, but I'd also argue one of the other huge reasons why within Slovakia the Rusyns aren't really concerned with politics is because they're poor. Like that whole Prešov region is destitute, and their main focus is survival. And when I speak to my family, so my father's side is from Western Slovakia, right outside of Bratislava, and the mother's side is all from the Prešov region. And just kind of hearing the differences in their lifestyle is kind of astounding. And especially, I hear that the pensions they have are 300 euros a month, which how do you survive off of that? And like average salaries are 500, 600, 700 euros a month. But it's unbelievable to me how these people were even able to manage surviving there. And so I think a lot of it really comes down to the economic realities of the region being the poorest, if not one of the poorest regions in all of Slovakia, is they people that um, aren't well off and have to worry about the food they're putting on their table won't care about the greater political symbiosis of the nation as much. Now, um, and I will also say that I feel like it's kind of been the same there for hundreds of years in the past, where I feel like the reason why Rusyn political sovereignty didn't really blow up as much as it could have was partially because of the population loss during the late 19th, early 20th century, where many Rusyns ended up leaving the region altogether. And, just the fact that even back then, people were more concerned about their own survival than the greater political symbiosis of the nation.
Well,
So
I would give them a pass on that, except Subcarpathians are poorer than them, and they're one of the poorest regions in Ukraine. I mean, we can say that, and I totally understand that.
Right.
And yet, there has to, of course, be this economic part has to be part of it. And yet, I will say I was in both Subcarpathia and Priyashiv, and Subcarpathia is just a completely different world of poverty. It was incomparable between the two, and so really? I think we can go with this. But I've always heard a joke about Western Slovaks that they won't cross Poprad or whatever town is right there. I've heard that joke about them.
They go to Poprad to ski. And especially Czechs. Czechs love going to the Tatras. There's a running gag in Slovak culture that whenever there's a hiker that dies in the Tatras, it's probably a Czech. But yeah, no. That there's definitely a reality to that. That the both regions are destitute. But I was aware that Subcarpathia was more poor, but not to the extent that you're describing. I wasn't actually aware.
No, it's one of the poorest. I mean, it is poorer than all of Galicia. Yeah, wow. I think it's on par perhaps with Bukovina. I don't think it may be one of those Dnieper regions, but it really is at the bottom. Wow. And I think this actually would be a good segue into the second article. Rusyn sovereignty. This is essentially what your article is about, and how you don't think it's possible from an economic perspective, at least. We'll go with that. And I'm probably not articulating the general idea of it well enough. So how about you give a better one?
Yeah, so I feel like I've already touched on it a little bit the past few minutes, but I can kind of elaborate. So I think the general argument of the article is that Rusyn sovereignty, if we were to kind of imagine this Rusyn state existing in the 21st century, and let's say that let's forget all of the political situations going on in Ukraine right now, and Russia, and all of Eastern. Let's just say in a vacuum, in a sense, that this Rusyn state exists right now. My argument is that this, in theory, that the state would, in and of itself, be an economically disastrous entity, mostly due to the fact that the urbanization in the region is almost non-existent, besides for Mukachevo, Uzhhorod, and Priyashiv, due to the fact that there aren't really any profitable industries that exist in the region, and just the general economic inequalities between these regions and their current nations' capital areas. So, for example, Bratislava is actually, people don't realize this, but Bratislava, the GDP per capita of Bratislava is higher than Budapest and Warsaw. it's a rich, wealthy, region. But like when you're looking at Slovakia as a whole, the numbers are more, on the average side of the European Union, and it's mostly because of the eastern half of the country. And like we discussed, Transcarpathia or Subcarpathia, sorry, is also a very poor region. So the biggest argument is the fact that um, young people especially these days, are fleeing from these regions into these larger metropolitan cities like Bratislava, Budapest, Kiev, Prague for greater economic opportunities, and that it's unlikely that this nation would survive based off of that, or rather would kind of be in a situation sort of like Moldova or other very destitute nations in Europe or even in other parts of the world where, yes, you have this nation state. However, the population is declining, birth rates are declining, and generally young people don't want to, live there. But, I do paint a picture at the end of the article kind of saying that, barring the economic analysis, I think that um, a Rusyn state, in theory, would end up being a net positive for Rusyns politically, because we would finally get our own political representation in Europe, like literally on the map, which we've never officially had. And in addition, um, there it would also, I think that in like, I think I was looking at this sort of phenomenon, this economic analysis, as the early 21st century in general. But looking forward, there could be some upsides because of the fact that, these days, post pandemic, post 2020, there are people that are able to actually work from home in, higher educated industries, and that could possibly be a way for people to kind of stay where they're living and sort of contribute to the economic output of their own region without having to leave to other areas. But I think that I sort of um, kind of combat that with the fact that there are, um, you will have a sort of the white collar class kind of staying in a sense, likely, in this future scenario. However, if you don't have any sort of those blue collar larger industries actually in the region, then like people that I would say use their hands to work can't really get jobs as much as as much as they would have in the past. So I guess that's kind of the general picture of what I wrote in the article. So yeah, give me your thoughts on that.
This seems very much like a chicken or the egg problem, in that I don't see a way in which economic prosperity will be achieved without greater centralized authority. And I'll say it like this and that. Well, we can try to further educate the Rusyns of these regions. We can try to increase their entrepreneurial abilities. And I think this is all a very good thing.
Right.
However, number one is I think that we truly have about 20 years left,
Yeah.
frankly, to make real change. So that's number one, and that unless we're going to do a miracle on the Han River, like how South Korea did,
Yeah.
and then somehow do political action after that, it's not going to happen from that kind of type of timeline, in that type of timeline. And I think too, I don't foresee these. I see if we so economically develop within these regions, within these current states, I very much see a problem arising where, well, guess what? We can make these regions prosperous if we can even do that without centralized authority. But then we will continue to gain people will start to influence us even more than what they have. So, for example, say Subcarpathia becomes a real bastion of economic development in Ukraine. Well, guess where everyone's going to go?
They're going to want to move to Subcarpathia.
We've already had problem.
Yeah.
I mean, most people have been leaving Ukraine in terms of actual Ukrainians have been leaving now that the war is kind of stabilized. But it's a demographic catastrophe in many respects. And nothing against these people inherently. It's just the fact that, say, Subcarpathia is still part of Ukraine, well, you're going to get 400,000 Ukrainians come in because of these economic opportunities. And it's going to be a situation where instead of Rusyns making up 60 to 75% of the population, they make up 40%. And so then we're pretty much like Abkhazia, where we're like 40% of the population. We're not even the majority. And any type of peaceful negotiation of further sovereignty is naive. So while I do very much respect your thoughts in the sense of that it would be an economic failure, I think that it is required to be economically prosperous. And that's my view on it long term, is that first centralized authority must come, and then economic development can further after that. And you can, of course, you can always try to, in pockets, continue to form economic, means of production. But this is a situation where if you get too prosperous, you're screwed, and if you don't, people will continue to leave. So I think that just overall, it's a sense of urgency, where at least, for example, if Subcarpathia had autonomous status, they'd have a lot more control over their borders, essentially. And so I think, at least in the 10 to 20 year term, we should, of course, focus on economic development, but also autonomy at the minimum, right? And so I think we need to have political power to even make sure this economic production is used correctly. And so I want to hear your thoughts on that, because it's very much different from what at least you said in your article.
Right.
What your opinion is.
Yeah, it's definitely a pretty different perspective on sort of the issues in the region. And I think that, the more I think about it, the more I kind of understand that. And I think that ultimately, from a political standpoint, yes, 100%. The first thing that should be done is sort of the call for autonomy. However, I think given sort of the current political landscape, it's especially given the war in Ukraine, I kind of almost wonder how that would be achieved without major backlash from Kyiv.
Well, I'm not just talking about Subcarpathia here, but I think there's two. I think there's two main problems here we have to look at. Is number one, the political situation geostrategically is horrible, but it's always been horrible. We've always had to deal with that. It's always been horrible, and we can see that.
Well, I'd argue the best time for us was during pre-war Czechoslovakia, even though there were definitely issues there, but at least there.
Well, we didn't control our own
we didn't
autonomous republic,
Right, we didn't, but at least that, at the very least, Rusyns existed, sort of in the mind of the Czechs and the Slovaks.
That's true. I would say, however controversial it is, I would say that the Hungarian government during World War II's crimes were atrocious. From a Rusyn identity standpoint, their control of Subcarpathia during that time was the most pro-Rusyn government we've ever had. Now, there's many different, there's many problems with that, because they liquidated the Jews, which that's not good, and all these other things. They took out a lot of the very interesting minorities that were in the region, whether it be the Germans who were kicked out and then had to settle in Subcarpathia. Many of them were forced to move after the war. And so they were definitely very horrible things, but that was the only point in time in which Rusyn identity was really promoted, right? So going back to...
What do you mean by... I'm actually sort of unaware of the situation during the Hungarian occupation. Like, what do you mean by promoted?
So essentially, they promoted a pro-Rusyn identity out of the fear that Subcarpathia would get absorbed into some type of Soviet state, into the rest of Germany. Essentially, what had been going on at the time was there's many problems with the Czechoslovak government in that they didn't control their borders very well, right. And they allowed many of these Ukrainian intelligentsia people, these former officers, essentially migrate to Subcarpathia, and they didn't have the political wherewithal to do anything, or to even know how to do anything. And so Hungary, fearing losing this major border, which it's of course a natural border because of the Carpathians, they, the Ukrainian identity and the Russian identity were both seen as unfavorable. So they promoted a local Rusyn identity. And so they, of course, destroyed the autonomous Subcarpathian Rus region. But in terms of identity, it was a very important time for Rusyns in that they had a good 4 or 5 years to continue to form the pro-Rusyn movement, the, how should I say it, Rusnophiles versus the Russophiles and Ukrainophiles. Yeah. So anyways, we're getting sidetracked here. So that's point one. We can talk about that offline if you'd like sometime. Number two, I think that regardless of the geopolitical problems, which have always been there, and this is just further accentuates them, what's going on in Ukraine right now, we also have a political and leadership class that is either incompetent or is not looking out for the goals that they should. And I can tell you, at least from my experience, they are fooling themselves. And I've heard more than once from important people, they say along, because you get to know these people after you've gone to enough events and everything, they say, it's wonderful that we didn't or haven't strove for political power, because this means we can build up our cultural prestige and cultural power. And to that I say, this is an enormous, to use a modern word, cope, frankly.
Yeah.
In that, these, it's foolish to think that. And so I think that in the next 20 years, at least from my perspective, it would have to be a thing of where we would replace this leadership class and also further inject this desire for autonomy, or at least some type of sovereignty, right? So I've talked too much. I kind of want to hear your response to that.
Well, the first thing that I kind of wondering about is, you talk about this political class. Who is this? Like, I'm not aware of a Rusyn political class in the first place.
Well, I shouldn't say political class, but I should say a better word for them is the activist class.
Okay.
And I would say many people who are the leaders of the diaspora are in this class.
Okay.
I would say the kind of thought leaders of the current organizations in Slovakia and in Subcarpathia.
Sure.
And I'm not going to necessarily say their names here.
Yeah.
But they are very much an internationalist-based class. Pretty much anyone who attends the World Congress of Rusyns is included, as a delegate, is included in this vision of what it is. And they're so fragmented that it's hard to call them a class, right? But they are in some respects, because they hold all of the local power.
Gotcha. I understand that. Okay. Now, the second thing I'm wondering is, while I kind of understand somewhat their argument by saying, oh, well, thank God we're not, taking a political aim at this where we can develop our culture. Well, I'd argue that we already have our culture, and how about we look to the future and continue developing it, but at the same time, while understanding that if there is no sort of political representation of Rusyns, not in the homeland, what culture will we have in 20, 30, 40, 50 years? That's what I would say to that. So I honestly argue that part of it still probably comes down to kind of a fear of perhaps the Ukrainian government, or sort of a backlash that it almost seems like they're kind of afraid of an intellectual fight. That's kind of what I'm imagining is sort of one of the root issues there, that they're kind of they don't want that. They fought so hard for sort of that Russian unification of the early 90s following the collapse of communism, that they don't really want to put up a fight for political aims. So that could be it, but I don't know. What do you think? Do you think sort of my analysis of that is sort of correct, or?
I would go. I think in general you are correct. I think there's two important elements here that will illuminate you and the audience to their failures. So number one is that coming out of the Cold War, many of these ideological leaders, even if they weren't very much visionaries in any real sense, they put all their eggs into the basket of Western internationalism.
Gotcha.
And this was primarily due to the fact that, well, the Soviet Union was on the opposite side of that. And that, well, guess what? The EU comes, and perhaps not on purpose, but the fact that, Slovakia joins the EU, Poland joins the EU, many of these Western institutions helped bring about the process of Rusyn recognition in these countries. And they helped come about, they helped turn the tide in the sense of that Rusyns could now be open and they could be free. And so there's this glorified image of
the Western
world.
Yeah, okay.
Now, my view on this is that it's a cage in the sense of that, well, we can be recognized and we can have our little tiny festivals, but until we actually want to do, but when we want to do anything of real meaning, you're going to get smacked in the face. And that's my general view on that. Yeah. I think number two is that probably the biggest problem, even besides all this, I think the first was more ideological inclinations. I think the second one is more just the reality, is that many of our top leaders are either, number one, bureaucrats or academics, and number two, their careers are tied to Western power structures. So I'll give an example here. Magochi. Professor Magochi, I think he's still the chair of the Ukrainian studies at the University of Toronto.
Yeah.
Now, he is a fantastic academic, right?
Of course, yeah.
But he took on the role of being a political Rusyn leader. He led the World Congress of Rusyns. He was very involved in many of the political decisions post 1991.
Right.
And however, we must realize that if he would have crossed the line, his career would have been ruined. It would have been finished. Yeah. I mean, hell, he's the chair of the Ukrainian studies. Imagine a Rusyn, imagine there would be a complete severing of any type of future.
Yeah,
and many of these same people, who I think some of them are either working for the feds or just are, whatever. Many of these people who are supposedly the greatest Rusyn leaders, especially in the diaspora, they work for the United States government in their day jobs.
They glow in the dark. They glow in the dark.
Yes, yeah, they're total glowies. And so the fact is that, but this is a common occurrence of, for example, many in Slovakia and Poland in the past, they had government positions. Or guess what? Many of our organizations in the homeland, they're not funded by Rusyns. Guess who they're funded by? Bratislava,
yeah,
Warsaw. Kiev, not really Kiev, frankly, but I shouldn't say that one. But in Romania, Bucharest funds a lot of the Rusyn activities there. So guess what? You can have this cage, you can say you're Rusyn, you can do your festivals, but as soon as you step out of line, guess what? Your income's gone, your organizational funding is gone. And this is the reality of that. Both ideologically, it's messed up, and also just being a realist, these people were never they were never against the establishment in any real way. They were products of the establishment. And so it's no wonder these fools completely shit the bed on doing anything important with that 1990s energy. And so that's my argument of both these things, is that we glorified these people, and yet at the end of the day, they took something which had massive potential and they squandered it for the most part. And so the next generation should, number one, probably not be academics. Now, academics can, of course, write what they want. I'm talking about just the politicians, the people who are in positions of power should not be academics per se.
Yep.
Of course, academics will always be part of the intelligentsia class, and we need to get rid of funding from these national governments. And so that's my kind of general view of why this political class may seem to be forward thinking and be true Rusyn visionaries, and yet they were either trapped or willingly stuck in this very tight framework. So that's a long answer to your question.
Well, okay, so I definitely agree with the vast majority of the points you put out there, but kind of just specifically looking at the Western influence. So I think that from what you said, from their perspective, especially the fall of communism, the time period, the West won the Cold War, and it made sense to sort of kind of be aligned with these Western internationalist ideas. But in 2022, I think that the biggest issue that globally we're facing right now is that Western influence and American influence is, it's falling. It's not what it was at one point. And I'd argue that the American empire has already died. It's if not currently dying.
It's a carcass, yes.
It's a carcass of what it once was, for sure. And I think that ultimately the future, we can get into so many different avenues with this conversation, but what I will say is that the future is uncertain, almost in the sense that we have no clue what the next hegemonic force will look like in the world. It could be China. It could still be the United States. It could be a united Europe. We don't know. But ultimately, I think that the perspective that the Rusyn community should take going forward should kind of be a realist, neutral perspective in terms of global geopolitics, understanding that at the end of the day, sort of being propped up by one specific idea, one specific geopolitical ideology and sort of geopolitical force it's almost short-sighted and could be sort of beneficial for a short term, but in terms of long-term political development, I think it's quite dangerous. So, what I'm basically trying to say is that the geopolitical reality that we're living in today, in the past 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, is likely changing. And if Rusyns are able to adapt to that, especially the Rusyn political class, then it's likely that we'll have a successful future.
I would say also, too, that I don't necessarily think that ideological vision is even necessarily here anymore. I just think it's running on the scripts that we've been running for the past 30 years.
Right.
And I think that if you look at how these different institutions run within Russian society, you will see that it's not even necessarily ideologically based like how it was previously. It's
Yeah.
almost as though we're just doing the same things because that is what our society does, you know? And
Yeah.
yeah.
What's interesting is that something I definitely want to explore more in future articles is sort of anti-Westernism and Russophilia within Russian communities. And something I've noticed, especially when looking in Central European politics, you have the Poles and the Czechs and the Hungarians, less so the Hungarians, but the Poles and the Czechs, who absolutely hate the Russians. But then you have Slovakia,
which is pretty fine with them, actually, if you look at it.
Yeah, when interacting with anyone really from Slovakia, I mainly hear anti-Western arguments, even within Slovak communities in the United States where I'm currently living. I always, it's funny. There was this was 10 years ago now, and this guy, he's born in Slovakia. He owned a restaurant in New York, and we were talking, just about the current situation in the world. And he made a joke with me, and he said, "Oh, how much will a Big Mac cost in 20 years?" And I said, "Well," he said, 10 rubles. And I was like, I've always found it very interesting how Slovakia specifically is largely been anti-Western, especially since the fall of communism. Minus obviously, Bratislava, but and I think part of it could be that people in my grandparents' generation, so what would be the equivalent of the baby boomers in Eastern Europe. I don't know if you'd also call them boomers, but that same generation, the post-war generation, they kind of grew up and in a time period where, yes, like you had political repression, generally speaking, it wasn't, communism was evil and it wasn't an ideal system, but see, some of these people's situations compared to now, like at least back then, from their perspective, you had a house, a place to live, food to eat, and a job. Now, some people don't even have that, and I feel like a lot of that blame is put on sort of Western influence and, frankly, the United States. So I've always found it interesting, and definitely, I'm very interested to kind of see how that kind of develops into the future if Slovakia kind of become sort of I don't even know where I'm going with that, but ultimately what I'm trying to kind of understand is why Slovakia and even Russians in Slovakia have usually been more Russophile than anything else, or at least just anti-Western,
Well, I think that Slovakia in itself is a whole different story, and I think even current views of the war, I think perhaps Rusyns more take their views from modern Slovak society rather than any greater historical precedents.
Right.
But of course, Rusyns historically, Russophilia was the largest movement by far for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of this has to do that ethnically we're very close to them, just being real. And also number two is that they helped fund a lot of our cultural activities. A lot of our churches were, for example, the Tsar even donated a whole church bell to my grandparents' church in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota.
Wow.
And this was a common thing for new Rusyn churches to have this kind of like gifts from the Tsar. And they were, by and large, the reason why we didn't assimilate into everyone else. So I think historically, there's obviously many good things that came of that. Of course, you have a lot of downsides, but historically, I can see why Rusyns, and also more educated Rusyns, would perhaps not be so inherently anti-Russian. Like, for example, I don't necessarily see them as the enemy, but I'm certainly not advocating for any allyship with them just because I am a kind of realpolitik kind of person.
Right. Yeah.
But I see them as an enemy, as an enemy who is one country further away from us, and
Right.
I can definitely see. I mean, this was certainly my experience when I went to Slovakia too. It was a lot of pro-Russian activity, and I don't know why, and it would be interesting to find out more. Maybe you should. Maybe we'll get you to go to Slovakia, and you'll do some research to find out. Who knows?
Well, luckily,
The Slovak society.
Luckily, I'm already planning on it soon, anyways. But yeah, well, just for the record, like I'm not pro-Russian by any means. Like I don't, I don't like, I don't. Some people in Slovakia say, oh, well, when they invaded Ukraine, they should have stopped in Prague. Well, no, like I don't want.
That's just absolutely idiotic.
Yeah,
that's
like
a little too far.
Yeah. Wait, like I view myself as someone that, given the war in Ukraine, like yes, like I support Ukrainian sovereignty, and I support that the fact that Putin did not have the right to go in and invade Ukraine just because he wants a free land grab, right? But just generally speaking, like I'm an American, obviously, and I'm proud to be an American. But I think on a global scale, I definitely kind of fall in with the sort of Rand Paul, not even Rand Paul, because he's kind of gone off the wagon, but Ron Paul, his father, sort of realist perspective on American interventionism, where following sort of if not really the non-aggression principle, but sort of almost like a realist perspective on foreign politics. And I think that if we followed, if the American government has followed that in the past 2 decades, a lot of good would have come out of it. But that's a whole different story. But I think ultimately, like I would kind of view myself as a realist that's neutral in terms of foreign relations, and like especially when it comes to Russian issues, I think that we should sort of act as an entity that is very skeptical of foreign sort of intervention in our affairs, because for the most part in the past, foreign intervention in our internal affairs has not really led to many good things happening. But I also think that it's interesting because the way I view it, I think that like the Visegrad group, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Czechia, sorry. I think that this is obviously my opinion, but I think for them, sort of the best political strategy would kind of be neutrality between the West and the East, even though they're inherently more pro-Western. But I think that at the same time, it's sort of difficult because they've kind of acted as a buffer zone, to put it mildly, between
historically
the West,
they have
between the Western powers and Russia. So I understand why they're skeptical of sort of Russia, but also I would also argue they should just have the same amount of skepticism towards the West as Russia, because you never know who could take control in Germany or Britain or even the United States. Democracy is fragile. Republics are fragile. I'd argue that modern republicanism is dying as we know it. I'd even go as far as to say that the American Republic is going to be dead in the next decade as we know it. As an American, it has not been this divided ever.
I think the Civil War could have been.
I was about to say the Civil War, but barring that, it's just it's not looking good for the United States. So I think ultimately what I'm trying to get to is the fact that as a whole, Rusyn should sort of look with what's the word, skepticism towards sort of any single power as being their main influence. You understand what I'm saying?
I think that this can also be worded into we should actually understand what our own interests are, and and be uncompromising in trying to achieve them. And then I think
Right.
all of these other things will fall into place as soon as we realize that, and as soon as
Agreed.
we act that out. And
Agreed.
that's
Yep.
something I'm writing about, but we'll see when it gets released at some point. But do you have any other kind of final statements for our audience before we go here? We're about, I'm not sure, I think we're at roughly the hour mark, so
Okay.
I think we'll wrap it up now. But the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I think that the base that the previous generations of Rusyns gave us is relatively good. You know, we have a strong, vibrant culture. We have people, plenty of people in the world that call themselves Rusyns, and you know that number is growing. You know, even though you know I saw the previous podcast for the situation in Slovakia specifically, you know, the linguistically, it's you know it's kind of wishy-washy with that. But I think ultimately what we have, the situation that we were given, can be turned into a positive, but we have to act fast. Otherwise, within a generation or two, things might not look too good, and I think Russian culture might end up becoming sort of like what's an example of a culture that died off? I don't even know, but
they could be Manchurians.
Yeah,
kind of like how they are.
Right. So I think that what we need is a lot of young people that are forward-minded to become leaders in the community, in the homeland and in the diaspora, in order to facilitate a political movement for, at the very least, Rusyn autonomy. And I think from there, you know, the leaders of the movement can kind of create goals from that point on. But I think that the first thing that needs to be done is legitimate political action, and without that, you know, there is no future. But you know, besides the politics and all, I think that Russian language and education of Russian linguistics should be also encouraged throughout the community. What's unfortunate is that in my own family, from what I understand, I've heard different accounts, but so like my second cousins and such, the people that are like my age, they understand Rusyn, but I don't think they actually can speak or write the language. So I think that will pose an issue specifically within Slovakia. But you know, at the end of the day, if there is legitimate political action that is created by Rusyns in the homeland, I think more people that identify or have Rusyn heritage will kind of see that and be inspired, sort of like I was with your YouTube channel, Lemko with History. That kind of inspired me to kind of you know, be involved in the community, because without that I wouldn't even kind of understand the issues that Rusyns are facing. And I think something else I also want to mention is that something like Tallerhoff was never taught to anyone. You know, like for like my grandparents when they were growing up, they never knew what happened if Tallerhoff was. You know, and I actually showed them that documentary a couple months ago, and they were in just complete shock that, first of all, did this actually happen, and they were never taught about it, and second of all, that they built a literal airport on the graves of Rusyns. Like it's unbelievable. And you know, something that one of my grandparents said was that look what the Western powers have done to us. They haven't even apologized. The Austrian government hasn't even apologized for it. You know, it's unfortunate. But yeah, I think that the more people that get involved in the community, especially in regards to the political action in the community, the more likely we are to survive.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Of course. Thank you for having me on.